thank you, Philip, for the introductions, and thank you for what you do here. It really is an incredible achievement to keep this going year in, year out, and a wonderful kind of gathering. I've been coming to Red May, I think now for almost 10 years, and I'm always happy to be invited back, so thank you. And thank you to Jamie for writing this really incredible book. And I'm really not just blowing smoke. It's a really, really important book. I think it's really rare in my experience to read a book that is so lucidly written, so economical in its formulations, and yet so wide-ranging in its explanatory power. It really is a book that helps us understand the present and how we got here. And it does so in what I would say is a rigorously Marxist way, which means that along the way, Jamie is skewering a whole range of kind of conceptual figures that purport to be solutions to the crisis, but that in fact fall apart on closer inspection, whether it's modern monetary theory or the very idea of populism, or even the nation-state horizon as the sort of source of kind of a self-governing future. So I think there's really a lot to be said, and I thought for my part here, rather than saying any more, that I would try to prompt Jamie at various points to talk about the book and to kind of expand upon, elaborate, and take it in any direction that you want to take it. So I thought I would just begin by, and I'm really too old to be reading notes off my phone, but I'm going to. I'm going to begin by sort of offering just a short excerpt from the book, a short reading from the book that hopefully will prompt you, Jamie, to begin your remarks. So this is a section around the middle of the book which is headed Epitaph for an Era. What we knew as neoliberalism was essentially the political administration of the planetary factory. Its free market ideology and laissez-faire approach to governance could only last so long as the factory continued to hum along more or less smoothly. Growth was bound to slow once the bulk of the factory's surplus had been pumped out and distributed between the nations competing over it. Now the slowdown is shaking the established order to its foundations, like an earthquake ripping through a dilapidated city. This tremendous subterranean shift is the underlying cause of the end of America's informal empire and the return of economic nationalism. I think it's a great distillation of the sort of broad thesis of the book, which does come around the middle of it, after Jamie sort of walks us through an account, really, of what globalization is and why it has come to an end. So I thought maybe to begin at the beginning, maybe you could tell us what globalization is and why it has come to an end. Mm-hmm. Sort of proceed from there.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think what that passage is summing up is I guess what we could look back retrospectively and sort of see as what we used to call the neoliberal era, kind of the era of globalization, when free markets and market competition and the laws of free trade and commerce and investment were supposedly going to, lead to rising incomes, rising trade, and increasing commerce between the countries and peoples of the world. And the debate on the left throughout like the 2010s and before even was around neoliberalism as a mostly kind of like a market fundamentalist kind of ideology that was like the vanguard of globalization, right? And it was led and then kind of formulated by figures like economists like Milton Friedman, and before him Friedrich von Hayek, who, the story went, kind of just had the right ideas at the right time when the crisis of the 70s, the global sort of inflationary crisis, broke out, and the Keynesian managerial, economists and elites sort of proved intellectually bankrupt and unable to control the outbreak and the crisis from the standpoint of policy or politics or whatever. And so the narrative on the left for a while was kind of like, neoliberalism was this class project to reimpose corporate rule over restive working class and begin to dismantle, the national kind of welfare states that have been built up in the wake of the Second World War, and impose the rule of the market on on society again. So neo is a reinvention of liberalism. And what I'm trying to get at with the planetary factory idea, which, by the way, I know that Phil Neal has a book coming out called Hell World, and I think planetary factory is in the subtitle of it. I think we've independently kind of arrived at this concept. I think what I'm trying to do in the book is reconfigure our understanding of what neoliberalism and globalization was, which is sort of after the post-Cold War moment when the Soviet Union disintegrates, China really begins to open up its markets and to integrate into global value chains, and as well as many other countries. Huge reserves of workers and labor, right, are incorporated into the capitalist global workforce worldwide. And the global economy begins to take on the form of this sort of parcelized, fragmented value and supply chain structured form, essentially, where growth is happening more by segmenting production through different countries and different processes and different components, essentially, and spreading the division of labor, the industrial division of labor, across dozens and dozens of countries to make like one product, right? And that's one side of the planetary factory, and the sort of the conceptualization in the book is sort of suggesting also that the massive expansion of finance and financial capitalism that kind of grew up in parallel with that sort of value and production structure, mostly but not entirely in the global north, is kind of like the administrative layer of that, the kind of managerial, I guess, upper half, where a lot of the mental labor, right, designing the intellectual property and the patents and the financial instruments and these kinds of products and instruments that went into structuring the global factory as a production system were made themselves. And the argument in the book, and that is kind of encapsulated by that passage you read, Nikhil, is that expansion, that great expansion into this new pool of labor post-Cold War, this new pool of like surplus value extraction worldwide, only had so much to go before it began to reach its own limits of growth. And the newly industrializing, newly developing countries, including China, begin to deindustrialize themselves, and as well as other newly industrializing countries. So deindustrialization is striking faster, right, and happening more widely. It's not just a phenomenon of the advanced global north, the old capitalist countries. And the argument in the book is that that's a symptom of the decline of capitalism as a global economic system, that it can no longer produce the surpluses that are required to reinvest and to expand capitalism on a larger scale and create rising incomes, right, which is kind of like, the elites kind of see that still as the glue that holds society together, and keeps it from descending into chaos and political conflict. And so it can't really do that anymore effectively. And as a result, states and political elites, economic elites have to become more, take more and more drastic interventionary measures into their national economy in order to just keep it sputtering along, basically, at the same, at a lower and lower rate. Each sort of recovery from the crisis is lower than the previous recovery. I mean, you can look at the empirical data, and like per capita GDP growth rates, labor productivity, public and commercial debt. If you want to look at that, it goes in the other direction, right? As the growth indicators go down, commercial and state debt just goes up and up and up, right? Line goes up in that area. And so it suggests that the capitalist economy globally is on a very specific path, and the political and economic elites don't really have a better sense of a way out of it except the escalation of these very belligerent new trade wars, essentially, that Trump is really the vanguard for. But once the U.S. takes that position, it sends a signal essentially to the rest of the world that, okay, these are the new rules, right? And they are indeed, countries around the world are adopting their own industrial policies and their own kind of aggressive and defensive measures, even as they're maybe trying to strike a deal, supposedly, a deal with Trump on the side. And so yeah, I think I would call globalization neoliberalism, whichever term we want to use, is kind of another word for this planetary factory, right? That is now breaking down, essentially.
So I want to just kind of pull you back, because I think your answer it's a great answer, and it gets us to the kind of the heart of the narrative of the book, which is really about the sort of the temporal account, which is really about the post-war global system and its neoliberal reinvention, and then the subsequent unraveling of that, right? But you early on in the book simply say flatly, globalization is the name for the expansionary dynamic of capitalism itself, which I think is actually a bigger claim and a really interesting one, and obviously more of an epochal claim.
Oh yeah.
Right? So there's sort of two levels on which you're thinking. Like on the one hand, you're thinking about, and the second level is not really the narrative of the book, but it is the framework of the book, the analytical framework, the sort of insistence that we have to understand capitalism from the perspective of the entire world, as a world system. And so one of the things I was struggling to think through around the concept of Endgame, and I want you to talk about it a little more, because your answer you just gave sort of suggests that the Endgame is about the specific history of globalization related to the collapse of neoliberalism or collapsing neoliberalism. But the Endgame also, it seems to me, is the end of the expansionary dynamic of capitalism itself, which is a much bigger story and a much bigger problem. So can you just kind of think through those two dimensions of the kind of argument as you're laying it out?
So in the book, I do trace the kind of history of globalization as kind of a historical process that unfolds beginning, one can always argue over timelines and when things begin and when they don't, but at least the narrative of the book kind of begins around the time that like Adam Smith and the kind of classical, political economists are writing about this new system that they see coming into existence, and that they're sort of searching for new vocabularies to describe, and that they're trying to get at this what they see very early on as its ability to expand, to create income growth, to through trade and through commerce and investment. And it's from the beginning, right? It's what they kind of get at, or what I suggest in the book, is that they do sort of see the seed of that expansionary dynamic that would then go on, that would spread out from a sort of corner of the world, and mostly around Western and Northern Europe, to basically every corner of the planet, and not smoothly, of course. In fact, very chaotically, but but they sort of they found a vocabulary. They were searching for a vocabulary to describe what they were living through and what they were seeing. Adam Smith and then Friedrich List, a great sort of nationalist, developmentalist, German economist from the 1840s, very important figure in the kind of nationalist economic tradition. Also is given some treatment in the book. But I think the kind of, I guess the turning point, if I were to try to pick one, in the kind of the history of globalization is the spread and development and ability to generate growth of capitalism comes after or during the Second World War and the Great Depression and the massive intervention into the national economies of the advanced industrial states that happened at that time, and the kind of path that put capitalism on from that point forward, where the technocrats and the economists and the political elites were going to be much more sort of hands-on and actively involved in trying to manage this thing. And the state was going to be spending much more money to try to stabilize the economy and sort of remove capitalism's tendencies toward breakdown and depression, and basically they committed themselves to doing whatever it takes to avoid another 1930s. Right, is essentially kind of one of the most important outcomes of what historians would call the post-war settlement and the kind of Keynesian liberal manager state. But what that ultimately led to was a commitment on their part to no matter what, to do whatever it takes to prevent capitalism from repeating that. And so the state then becomes the vehicle or the institution that picks up the slack and that takes on the burden of all of capitalism's contradictions and tendencies toward breakdown and collapse. And so beginning from that period of the rise of the so-called mixed economy, right, as the Keynesians called it, you begin to see the trends toward rising public debt, rising government debt, and different forms of intervention in government intervention in national economies that sort of develop as the economy evolves, takes new forms. Up to now, where we live in essentially like a bailout state, right, where the central bank especially, but also the Treasury, have committed themselves to doing everything possible to spend as much money as they need, right? Trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars, unimaginable sums, just to keep it ticking over. And so that's kind of that's part of this long-term trend where the 1930s was kind of an inflection point where it became clear, like Marx's prediction, right, that like this thing is gonna just collapse. It did. That was the Great Depression. And it was only through this historic intervention by the capitalist governments of the world, the violence and cataclysms of the world wars, the rise of fascism, etc., that they found their way out of that great crisis, right? And for some bought a little more time through this new mixed economy, mixed state capitalist formation. But now and this gets to the long-term horizon, right? That regime is running up against its limits. That was sort of forged in the wake of the Second World War, and as a result, we have the current government just renouncing, right, the U.S.'s sort of the international responsibilities, the stuff that we were talking about at the event last night, renouncing its sort of post-war commitment to an international, responsibly managed capitalist order, renouncing the very idea of international norms and rules and transparent sort of legal mechanisms and human rights, right, and basic commitments to humanitarian values, which even if they are always kind of hollow, they always, at least rhetorically, paid lip service to it. Now obviously the Trump regime will have none of that. And so it's both the end of that post-war, like, mixed state, mixed economy regime, which is itself part of this much longer trajectory of decline of capitalism as a system of globalization.
That's great.
Globalizing economy.
That's really, really helpful. I'm not really keeping track of the time, so whoever wants to keep track of the time and tell us when we might want to stop or open it up, please just tell me, because I have a few more questions. So the way you've just framed it, at the core of this, right, is a story about the end of growth, right? And that the end of growth is what spurs the crisis that makes, in part, at least as it manifests here, the United States become the state that wants to tear down the very system it created.
Yeah.
Right? That the end of growth, and we can sort of see this really if you look back maybe the last 40 years. It's not exactly your book, but the various gambits that have been sort of issued forth to try to restart or jumpstart growth, or to imagine a way that the United States could reignite the sort of form of the system, or reanimate the form of the system that's dying, whether it's the Iraq War or the kind of the effort to resurrect the rules-based international order, or the Biden second Cold War, or the Trump trade war. They're all different kinds of almost kind of gambits by often sort of small groups of elites who kind of say, no, well, now we have the key to sort of turn the ignition back on of this sputtering, right, the sputtering engine. So can you just walk us through a little bit more, because it's a very intricate argument, and a lot of people these days talk about the end of growth, and we have the sort of the Brenner story, right, and we have the various kinds of accounts that get built on that. But I think you've offered a really clear, again, and sort of easy to, because it's not an easy or uncomplicated story, but easy to follow argument about what that is. Could you spend a minute on that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The engine of the slowdown, right, of like secular stagnation. People have different names for it. You hear secular stagnation. You hear growth slowdown. Economists have been puzzled about why productivity has been dead in the water since like the 80s. There's over and over again, right? There's a productivity revolution coming around the corner, and it never seems to arrive. So capitalism gets its profits, its revenues, and it's basically the different forms of its surplus that the ruling class sort of takes from the exploitation of labor, of labor power, and that's the original source of its dynamism and of its sort of productive capabilities, is that humans are amazingly like creative and energetic and dynamic creatures, and that's where profits ultimately come from, right? They come from the extraction of the surplus value from labor, from workers, the working class. At the same time, for many different reasons, right? Capitalists are driven because of competition, because of like workplace class conflict, because of various technical considerations, to automate labor power away and to replace it with equipment and machines and advanced technology and everything that sort of allows them to shed labor as this kind of like, in their minds, right, this like inconvenient appendage that they would rather not have to rely on if they didn't have to for profits, right? And this is like the sort of the current mania for artificial intelligence is like the kind of the apotheosis of this, right? Like eventually it's just going to be all robots talking to each other, generating slop on the social media platforms and inundating it with that, and we're just kind of clicking through it, like the content that the machines are producing. And the problem, though, of course, is that deletes the source of labor power from the capitalist production process, the ultimate the ultimate source, which is human labor power. And so you have this dynamic where the advanced producers will, the most advanced sections of industry, manufacturing, and economic activity will innovate, will replace workers with production processes that allow them in the short term a higher rate of profit than their competitors, right, in other parts of the world, other countries. But over time, as those processes are generalized, as more and more capitalists adopt them, it reduces the overall amount of labor power, right, that's being exploited by the capitalist class. And so it's producing less of a surplus, less surplus value, and that leads to less profit, less surplus to be reinvested into new productive facilities, new lines of production that will, particularly the kinds of economic production that would lead to high productivity, high income growth for the ruling class, the owners, and the workers, right? Which is, again, the thing that eludes them even now. And so that's the dilemma, right? Like the drive to productivity, to ever higher productivity, is both the driver of capitalism's like dynamism and its undoing at the same time, right? And that's what drives what people like Brenner will call the over competition or over capacity problem. I call it an accumulation crisis. There's just not enough profit and not enough surplus value anymore available to expand capitalism globally on a large enough scale that would employ labor on a wide enough scale that would allow incomes to grow broadly for everyone. And so you have this zero-sum dynamic setting in from that, what I would call an accumulation crisis. But that in a nutshell is like the product, is the
Right.
stagnation.
So how would you respond to someone who would say, you're underestimating the possibility that this is just a crisis of industrial-led growth, but there are other potential horizons to imagine restarting growth, whether it's the knowledge economy or something like that. I'm not defending those arguments.
Yeah.
I'm just asking if you would
Yeah.
have.
Historically, it is high productivity, sort of manufacturing and industrial and associated kind of processes and production that leads to broad income growth for the majority of people, because it allows higher productivity, allows corporate profits and wages to grow together, right? They don't have to be at each other's expense. If you're producing more and you're doing it efficiently, this is what happened for a limited amount of time after the Second World War, right? Workers' compensation and corporate profits can kind of go together, but can go up together. But there has to be a high enough like rate of output, and revenue growth for that to happen. And productivity is a crucial component of that. And historically, it's been those kinds of industries, like high productivity, industrial manufacturing, and the more technical kinds of manufacturing and industry that lead to that kind of growth, lead to the possibility of that kind of growth. And so, you will have the skeptics who will be like, no, look, there's going to be this AI revolution or something that is going to be this massive breakthrough, and it will revolutionize productivity and make solve the problems of capitalism. But the kinds of work that would mean for humans would be the same kinds of more labor intensive, like broadly like service sector kinds of work that now, the same kinds of labor that dominate the economy now, which are mainly service related, and in areas like finance, healthcare, retail, care economy, very labor-intensive forms of work, right? And as those forms of work have expanded, over the last several decades, we haven't seen a corresponding growth in productivity and in GDP growth and these other indicators. And that suggests that, value-creating labor is a specific kind of labor. And it comes from those kinds of very, the more productive kinds of industrial work that lead to the possibility for like rising incomes for all classes basically, and that kind of work is just going away,
So as we enter this end game, and maybe we'll sort of move our conversation towards a bit of a conclusion here. There's what you see as an intensifying competition around the global surplus. That is what we now call economic nationalism.
Yeah.
And I think you have some really arresting images of this and sort of accounts of this, and sort of thinking about these global value chains and sort of how they actually work, and then what their unraveling sort of might look like. And I think we're seeing or starting to experience what the unraveling might look like in a very incipient way. But then you sort of turn to think about what that's going to actually augur, right? Which you say is intensified repression and intensified class struggle. Mm-hmm. And you conclude the book this way with what you call the stage, the shop, and the street. And I just want you to say something about the stage, the shop, and the street, and about what a period of intensified class struggle, which we're already living in, looks like.
Yeah.
Right? Because I think sometimes we're sort of sleepwalking our way into it, even as it's happening.
Yeah. So, yeah, I wanted to kind of, I guess, give like at the end of the book, I didn't want to give a kind of like recipe for like here's how we're going to prosecute the class struggle, going forward, but rather just kind of like a diagnostic take, mm-hmm. right? That kind of sketches how we might think about it. And so, briefly, like the stage is meant as a metaphor for like the realm of images, basically, and the energizing force that has in political life. I mean, just think of the video of George Floyd being murdered in the summer of 2020, by Derek Chauvin, and the explosive effect that had. I mean, that kicked off that hot summer of that year. The image has the ability to catalyze, right, like incipient anger, rage, energy in new directions. And so it can be stuff like that. It can be political figures, right, like saying certain things in the public sphere, like Bernie Sanders talking about the working class. And, the first time a mainstream politician really did on the national stage in this country for decades was a salutary thing, right? But it's in the image arena of politics, right? The sort of spectacle of mainstream institutional politics with all the constraints that has. And so the stage is kind of meant to get at that, right? Mm-hmm. The role, the economy of images, and how that affects like the possibilities for class struggle and class war. The shop is really trying just to get at the new wave of labor organizing that's been really exciting and unfolding since really, not just since the pandemic, since before it too, in new sectors that previously hadn't had, right? Like a strong organizing labor movement in them, like coding, data science, retail, like the Starbucks Workers Union is very militant and dynamic, worker-led, bottom-up union. The Amazon, although it's lost momentum, but when I was writing, I had the Amazon Workers Union, right, the warehouse workers in mind as well, and kind of their connection to the struggles, the really titanic labor struggles that unfolded in China over the 2010s, over the state's response to the great 2008 crisis there, and the kind of dynamics that led to in that country, and the way the working class responded militantly to that. and how their fate, the fate of workers in that part of the world, are intimately tied to the fate of workers on the other side of the production process here, and sort of just trying to encourage us to think about how to see them as part of the same struggle, really. And then the street is, of course, the realm of the multitude, the masses entering history, at scale, like we saw in 2020, and at other key moments in the 2010s, where people just like masses of people from many different backgrounds enter the street, just ready to fight, right? And so that's its own, of course, very important, like, tactical form of prosecuting the class war. And so I'm trying to just draw the connection between these different ways of thinking about it. It's almost like we're looking at the class war from different angles or something, right?
Yeah.
Socially, culturally, economically. And I am convinced that I'm very skeptical, I should say, that Trump and his cronies are going to succeed, actually, in their vision as they've laid it out. And you also have to keep in mind that, well, that's a detail maybe we could talk about in the Q&A perhaps. There's very often a sense that they're just like a bunch of kleptocrats, like just essentially looting the government and the economy for Trump and his associates, and then retroactively trying to brand it as this like competent, attempt to make a new class compromise or something, or resolve the crisis of masculinity or whatever they might be saying on Fox News that day. So I remain skeptical that they can actually get out of this the way they're saying they are going to. What they might very well succeed in doing is just push the world much further down this very volatile and dangerous road, right?
Yeah.
Like, and just charging headlong down it.
Right.
Of neo-nationalist confrontation. And that's a way to resolve the stagnation problem of capitalism. That's what happened in the 1930s, right? That's what war does. It wipes out all the old, useless production and value, and creates new grounds for capitalists to invest and to build up, and for profits to be, healthy again in that build-up and reconstruction phase. And so that's kind of what I think we're looking at, and that's why I think it's the anti-war struggle is going to be absolutely crucial to however we conceptualize, class struggle going forward, and and just the question of revolution and all this gravity and seriousness. Like, we have to start thinking really seriously about that in the years to come.
That's a good place to stop. Thank you so much, Jamie.
Yeah.